Welcome to Church Pulse Weekly. It's Carrie Newhoff here. And for those of you who are listening, tuning in, we're spending the entire month talking about the next generation. And we've got a variety of guests set up for this. We're kind of capping that off this week. And if you're brand new to the podcast, thank you so much for listening. We know how important your time is. We try to keep it short, relevant, and data informed. And that's because I'm joined every week by David Kinnaman, who's the president of Barna. Welcome, David.
Hey, Carrie. Good to see you.
Yeah, good to see you too. So a couple of years ago, wow, that's hard to believe. I mean, you and I did an interview for my leadership podcast in person. I guess that was 2 years ago.
It
Feels like a different
was.
life now.
Yeah, almost exactly 2 years ago. I think it was August of 2019.
Yeah. So you released Faith for Exiles. The world goes into exile for about a year and a half, right? And now you and Mark sit down. And again, often we talk about data here, but you and Mark are going to unpack that in the interview itself. So, yeah, everything's changed. And in some ways, nothing's changed in the last 2 years, right? Or is that fair? Is that even fair, David?
I don't know. I think more things have changed in the last 2 years than have stayed the same. I mean, obviously, human beings are still human beings, and we're still eating breakfast, lunch, and dinner in those places of the world where we have enough resources to do that. But on the other hand, it feels like the pandemic, the political season that we've all lived through here in the U.S., the racial questions, some of these deepening divisions in societies across the world. Questions of surveillance state and social media and technology. It feels like so many of the things that Mark Matlock and I both talk about in the book, and we allude to in the sit-down conversation you're about to listen to, is this digital Babylon is sort of, we're predicting that we were going to do ministry in this increasingly disconnected age, where the authority structures of who you trust, how you understand the world, the greater narrative of being part of the Christian story is all degrading and changing, and it's sort of mediated by the algorithms. And so in some ways, that is more present today than it was even when we conceived of the book. And some of the, as you said, sort of the isolating effects of the pandemic are playing themselves out in terms of mental health and anxiety, weakening bonds between churchgoers and local congregations, and so I think a lot of things we were trying to hope the church would listen to are even more present today than they were when we wrote the book.
Well, good. Well, with that in mind, let's dive into your conversation with Mark Matlock.
Well, I'm here with Mark Matlock, one of my very good friends in life and in ministry. We've had the chance of working on this book, Faith for Exiles, which came out in 2019. And then we've worked on a lot of different projects over the years. We did a study called Teens in the Bible, Teens in the Supernatural, Teens in Evangelism. Mark was actually one of the early believers that research on teenagers would be really helpful to the church and to the work he was doing. Talk more, Mark, about first, welcome to Church Pulse Weekly.
Yeah, thanks.
Just jumping straight to business here.
Yeah, just get right in there, David.
What was the thought process behind those early projects as you were working with teenagers, focusing on trying to help equip church leaders to deal with the pressure points that teenagers were doing? We started working on this in the late 90s.
Yeah.
What were some of the things you were thinking about in terms of using research to help propel your ministry?
Well, one of the things was that there just wasn't a lot of really good information in terms of what was actually happening in teenagers' lives in a faith space. There were some generic kind of things, but I was really curious to know, ministry was primarily about evangelism and evangelism training among teenagers. And I was wanting to know, but what do they really know about following God? And it was almost like I could sense that this conversation was coming around the drop-off rate of teenagers as I was kind of making observations. I was traveling around the country and I was trying to figure out what deeper things are happening in their lives and how do we address those things. And that was what started that first phone call out of our ministry at the time. Was officing out of a garage. It was me and Mercy Me. We had our little conference called Planet Wisdom that we were doing. And we thought we'd do this research. So let's call Barna, the big research group, and see if we can figure out what to do. And, you were the one who took that call, actually. And so that began a long relationship with data and understanding teenagers.
When you think about what's changed since you began doing youth ministry, what are some of the big shifts? I mean, you started doing student conferences about what year?
I started doing them, back in 1991.
And so what do you think has changed in now 30 years as you look at sort of youth ministry culture? And then what's changed over the last 12 to 18 months?
Well, I think, a couple of really interesting things. One is that youth ministry became more of an academic pursuit. And so there are some really great thinkers in academia that really started to build as youth ministry started growing up, so to speak. But also, I think pastors started seeing youth ministers as a more important integrated part of their teams. And so we started seeing that role being included in more the overall leadership of the church. But in many ways, right now, there have been so many disruptions in the church and youth ministry and culture that with technology and how that's affected things, that in some ways youth ministry feels to me a little bit lost at the moment. And I think that's I feel like it's been disrupted quite a bit, and everybody's trying to figure out, how do we solve the needs of this generation best? How do we disciple them? And youth ministry lost a lot of its talent to church planting in the 90s. And so there's kind of a bit of a chasm that developed in terms of, kind of innovation and forward thinking in that space. And at the same time, things were shifting where the church growth movement was also kind of incorporating youth ministry into its field. And so there's kind of like this little void that happened. And we're kind of feeling, I believe, the impact of that right now. And I think the youth ministry is, probably more needed in our churches than ever before. That's the only way that we can reach the volume of youth that are out there that are in need of spiritual direction and education. But that's kind of the state of where we're at. So we've got some of the greatest thinking going on in that space. We have some of the greatest veteran voices and some of the greatest wisdom in youth ministry, but there's also like just this gap that seems to be out there. And I actually kind of am excited about that, because I feel like it's in this moment that something really incredible could take place. And something new can emerge in a really strong way. And, youth ministers are always struggling for every dollar. We always joke that, we're like literally the lowest on the totem pole in terms of authority, decision-making, direction setting, leadership in the church. And a lot of that hasn't changed. So we're fighting for everything we have, but at the same time, there's just a real moment for something new to emerge and for some really great things to happen. And I believe that we could be on the cusp of some of that. There's some things swelling out there that I'm excited about.
Yeah, this is a conversation we've had a lot through the years about how church planting and the church planting efforts of the last decade and a half or two decades have been great. I mean, there's a whole analysis of what's gone right, what's gone wrong around church planting, but one of the real downsides has been that people that would ordinarily have taken the youth ministry route into senior pastoring were church planters. And so we've talked a lot about that, just to track back to something you said that I think would be interesting to listeners. And so I think this sort of deficit of talent and of energy and of not just young people, but younger leaders who would have been the ministry leaders for youth ministry, I see it as well, that there's a sort of a different sort of vibration today that happens in terms of youth ministry than sort of the energy of youth specialties and other things that have happened in the past. Talk a little about some of the cool things you see bubbling up and some of the ways that you think the future of youth ministry might be bright, and maybe some cautions as well.
Yeah, well, there's some really exciting stuff that Kara Powell's leading out of Fuller Youth Institute that's getting ready to be explored more broadly in terms of some coalitions that are forming among people in youth ministry, and some really cool discipleship movement work that's taking place there. I think the pandemic has definitely made everybody think about discipleship differently, or the lack of it that's been happening in our churches. And I think that is creating kind of a hotbed of opportunity for youth ministry to really kind of nail down what does disciple making and discipleship look like. And I think that's because the larger church is having that conversation as well. It's really hard for a youth pastor to lead into things that they're seeing if they don't have the support of those above them. And that deficit is being felt at the higher levels of leadership in the church. And that means that the youth pastor has more opportunity to explore and invest in and direct things in that area. And I'm expecting to see a lot of innovation in that over the next 5 years.
What do you think the pandemic has taught youth ministry and sort of working with young people, has taught us about that?
Yeah, I think we're seeing the resilience of young people. I think it's definitely brought to mind just, how connectivity doesn't necessarily equal connection. And we have a connected generation. We've seen this in our research that we've done, globally with millennials, that the generation's connected, but they're still feeling loneliness. They're still dealing with mental health issues. And there is a huge gap. This younger generation Gen Z has a much broader vocabulary around mental health issues and what's going on than generations before them. And so there's a real divide there, because this generation can identify and articulate what's going on with them and what help they need. And we don't necessarily share that. We kind of are, I call a lot of my fellow Gen Xers, we're the suck it up generation, where, we were the Reality Bites was the movie that defined us, and we were the latchkey kids. And so we look at some of the things that these younger generations are dealing with, and we're forgetting that they are actually being, growing up in a worldview that has language and vocabulary around this, a way of thinking about their interior life and their mental well-being. We didn't have that. And so we have to kind of try to understand that. I think there's going to be some real opportunities for the marriage of discipleship and these mental health discussions that are really going to help us really see people be healed in the church as they're following Jesus more deeply.
No doubt. I think that's such a huge thing, and I don't want to miss it, that every listener for the podcast today should be making notes of that. I think that's a huge shift, even from when I began at Barna, that our ability to do research on topics has greatly expanded. There was like a long list of taboo topics. You didn't ask about sex, sexuality. I mean, religion was one area that George Barna started in early on to be doing polling. I mean, it's part of the reason why Barna was established, was that no other research entities were doing really much deep probing around faith, because it was a taboo topic. Gallup did some good work on church attendance and sort of denominational affiliation. But George Barna really started Barna Group by saying, hey, I think we could actually probe, elements of people's spirituality in terms of social research that had not been really looked at before. And and so when I started in 95, we did almost all telephone interviewing, and it was, very, very much, constrained to the areas that we were able to talk to people about over a telephone interview. But the last 10 years has really shifted, because there's quite a bit of, online you can do a lot more than you do via telephone. And then conversations around sexuality and social values, even our porn studies. People, we gave people the option of opting out of a porn study, and something like 97% of people sort of continued with the survey. And so people are just very open. And I think that's one of the great hallmarks of ministry today, the transparency, the openness, the ability to talk about just about anything. And as you say, the language of mental health, I think is a really positive development when it comes to ministry to Gen Z.
Yeah, there's no question about it. And what we're able to understand right now is fabulous. In fact, just the fact that we have so much exposure into the interior kind of private lives of teenagers, right? They're sharing everything with us instinctually on Instagram and, in their snaps and everything like that. And it's like, so we can see kind of what's going on in their life. And some of adults reacted too strongly instead of realizing, hey, wait a minute, let's not let them know that we're watching. And they've developed some pretty good filters to keep us out. But still, I was sitting there going, wow, what an incredible window into the life and the world of a teenager that we've been given, through this right now to help us go deeper. But at the same time, it's created a lot of disequilibrium because we're like, too much knowledge. What do I do with all this insight? How do I navigate this? How do I wrestle with this? And I think we're really seeing kind of like, these issues of, it's easy to come up with a theological position on something. It's harder to come up with a pastoral position on things. And what do we actually do practically as pastors and ministers in this space? And so, you see a little bit of that tension. It's easy to make a theological statement. It's harder to actually, love and nurture a person and care for them as their shepherd.
So make it really practical. What would be one way that we could take what we're seeing on social media or what we're experiencing in terms of screen time? We actually know from the research that a pretty good chunk of young people actually say they're not comfortable with the amount of screen time they use or their peers use. Help us like, what would be practical steps, whether we're, church leaders, Christian leaders, what are ways that we could take this moment and really disciple well, given the input that we're receiving and that transparency that we're able to observe?
Well, what I think is interesting, is that fact that a lot of teenagers are telling us, I spend too much time on my screen, so do my friends, and it's not necessarily a good thing. And I think what we often do is we teach against it. We don't have them arrive at conclusions. That's a slower process, but it is definitely more transformative.
Say that again. What's the difference there?
Preaching about it, like, let's teach about the screen use versus let's engage young people in the conversation about it, and let them arrive at conclusions that we help guide and direct them toward, because most of the time they just want space to process it. And we don't often do that. We usually just kind of say, hey, here's 3 tips for using your cell phone better, or for honoring God with your screen time. But we need to sit down and go, hey, do you think that your generation spends too much time on cell phones? And I always start with that question with teenagers, because that isn't putting them on the spot. It's like, evaluate others. They're real easy to do that. And then how about yourself? How do you see yourself in your generation? How do you fit into that? And get them talking about, what do you think a healthy, approach is to our screens? What would be some things we could do maybe that would help us, and let them arrive at those conclusions rather than trying to force a program onto them, if that makes sense. Yeah. Because I think they're having those conversations, they're thinking about it. They need somebody to guide them in how to think about it, how to build those disciplines up in their life.
Some of the data on mental health and on this idea of screens and even then intergenerational relationships, I'd encourage listeners to check out our Gen Z Volume 2, Gen Z Volume 1, and also Gen Z Volume 2, which just came out at the beginning of 2021 here. We worked on that with a great partner, Impact 360. And both those volumes really help lay out, kind of the issues of ministry to this generation, gender identity, which is covered largely in Volume 1, but ministry to the screen generation and some of the mental health issues. And then just I think that resource is so helpful. So you could check that out. The book Faith for Exiles, just for listeners to hear a little bit about the story there. I'd worked on a couple different book projects, Unchristian, which was focusing on really the perceptions of young non-Christians towards Christianity, that came out 2007, I think.
And that actually included some of that original research that we did on teens and evangelism.
It did. Yeah, recall. That's right.
Yeah.
And then we did the book You Lost Me back in 2011, and you helped a lot on a lot of the concepts in that, in terms of this concept of Babylon and access and alienation and authority. Some concepts that why this generation is different is that they have greater access. They're alienated from institutions and from relationships, and they have skepticism of authority in new and fresh ways. Again, some of these are age-old issues that affect humanity, but that's why we called it Babylon, because it goes way back. And then we decided we want to tell the story of like what's really working. And so, Unchristian, You Lost Me are some of the disconnections and the disappointments and disillusionments of a generation. But Faith for Exiles is really a book about the hope. And we describe in that project the 10% of young 18 to 29-year-olds who are really resilient in their faith. And it was really a story of like what's holding them to Jesus, what's holding them to the church, what's holding them together. It's been about 2 years now since that book has come out. We were working on it for a couple of years before it was published. So what do you think now? I mean, what have you learned as you've been out talking to people and trying to help people understand this message of resilient discipleship 2 years hence?
Well, it's really interesting because it is a hopeful book. And I think that's one of the fun things is when people read it, they're expecting the bad news, right? Like, what are we doing wrong? What's messed up with what we're doing? And, it's hard because research and data makes us deal with reality. I just did a discipleship test for a discipling client yesterday, and we got live in front of people. And I said, it was really hard about this alpha test is we're presenting this content. We're basically just saying, shoot arrows at us, right? Like just find everything that's wrong. But that reality is so important because it's only then that we can really see how our ideas, our ideals really rub against, gravity. And so a lot of people were kind of coming to the book thinking that, and they walked away going, wow, I actually saw things to be, hopeful toward and things that I can build into. So it was kind of fun to see that reaction. But what's interesting, given the fact that this book just came out several months before the pandemic, is how many people said, wow, this book is a little prophetic. And I've been meeting with a lot of seminary classes, a lot of youth ministry classes and higher ed have adopted this as a textbook. So during the pandemic, people were calling me, professors were calling me saying, hey, my students are reading your book. We're trying to figure out what to do with Zoom and class meetings. Could you come in and meet? So I did a lot of that during the pandemic, which was just fantastic to hear their reactions to the material. And one of the hard things was, we identify these 5 themes that kind of contribute to resilient discipleship. And we were looking at 18 to 29-year-olds who've stayed in the church and tried to understand what is contributing to that. And a lot of people are just saying, wow, if we'd only been following this book, the insights here earlier, we would have been better set up for the pandemic. And so the pandemic kind of actually prove the veracity of the research and the insights. And the best part is the pandemic doesn't outdate or make those things irrelevant. It actually is something that we can use to help us lead out of it. And I think one of the challenges is some of these 5 things, if you just hear them as bullet points, they seem kind of obvious, or maybe we're already doing that. But the key is we're not doing it enough. And so while we might be trying to help people experience Jesus, our research shows that there are a lot of people in our churches that are experiencing Jesus, but there are a lot of people that aren't experiencing him either. Why? And so those are the deeper questions that trying to tease out with people as they're trying to apply it into their life's work.
It's such a privilege to work with you, Mark. You're so thoughtful and talented and just spirit-led. And I appreciate your friendship and your partnership. It's been fun to, hear people respond to the book. And as you said, sort of during the pandemic, 30 days after the book came out, my wife was re-diagnosed with brain cancer. So that put a huge curveball, and rightly so, sort of attending to her needs as we needed to do medical attention.
We wrote a lot of the book while taking her to radiation treatments, downtown Los Angeles. I mean, we were had sticky notes on the dashboard and wonderful memories with Jill as we were writing the book and caring for her as well. So
thanks for saying that.
The book will always have a special place in my heart just because of that.
And we dedicated the book to Jill and also to Jade, your wife, whose faith inspires us. And thanks for just remembering that and honoring her and all that. And so I say that for the benefit of our listeners, and that our friendship is such a deep one, and you've been there for me through thick and thin, and then sort of this opportunity to serve into the church through the writing. We both wrote the book and then sort of launched the book into the real life of our experiences. And even though, you haven't had quite the cancer journey that I've had, thank God, you've had your own challenges through the last few years. So it's a testament to God's goodness, to his provision of our time and mental ability, and
it married where our kids are at too. I mean, this book was very personal because our daughters were going to college at the same time on both ends of the coast, and that was a wild experience going through that and thinking about, okay, we're sending them into this Babylon even more deeply because of the fields of study that they were going into, and it made these insights, I think, all that much more important to us as parents.
Well, if you haven't had a chance to check it out, we'd encourage you to check out the book. I think there's a lot of ways that our heart for this resilience among our own kids and then in our churches comes through. And just quickly hit those 5 areas again. As Mark said, it's not so easy as you'll hear these. It's not like, oh yeah, we got that. Really, the book is designed to help you take a deep dive, and there's a whole e-course if you're interested in that. Take a deep dive into how well you're really doing at these things, especially for those, you're going to have a group of students, of young people, of people in your congregation who express these resilient characteristics, but you're gonna have a big chunk of people who don't. And our goal is to try to help you raise the bar across all 5 of these practices, which it turns out correlate with the most resilient young people in terms of their discipleship. So just walk us through some of those 5 quickly.
Yeah. So, and I think what's really important to realize is that of the 4 different categories of exiles, there were 2, the habituals and then our resilient disciples. Those 2 groups are the ones that are within reach of our church. And that habitual group, which makes up a lot of students that are in our churches, but they haven't been grounded or seated yet in their faith. And there's some mystery around how that works. Is that something that we can help with? Is that something that's the work of God? But there is about 38% of these young people that are in our churches that are literally have their hand on the door in the pandemic. And I think this is the thing that, concerned you and I, as we were talking about what that group is like. We're like, it's almost like this group has a hand on the door and they're waiting for a reason to walk through it. And we kind of started looking at the numbers and wondering if the pandemic was actually revealing that had happened. But they are within our reach. They are frequenting our churches. They're there, but they're having a very different experience than those resilient disciples. And that's a real important part of the story. So experiencing Jesus is one of the qualities of those resilient disciples. They're experiencing Jesus very differently, though, than those habituals that are basically going to church about the same amount of time every month, but they're having different experiences when they're there. So we thought, well, why are those habituals going to church? Maybe it's because they've got a lot of friendships. So when we look at meaningful relationships, we found that was a theme. That was the second theme. Meaningful relationships was one of the contributing factors to resilient discipleship. Yet those habituals were having less meaningful relationship at church than the resilients were. So that wasn't completely a factor for why they were there. So there's we need to realize there's a lot of young people in our church that are really soft and malleable, and they're just sprouting, and they need to get those roots in place before something comes and snatches them away. So it's really important to realize that we have a great opportunity with the young people that are already in our roles, that are already kind of attending. The second thing that the third thing is cultural discernment, the ability to apply the word of God to what's going on in the world around them and understand what's taking place there. And that's not so much a culture war type of a thing as much as it is really being able to use the word of God to discern the media that they're intaking. There's the screens, things of that nature. We saw that there was a huge practical relationship between resilient disciples' use of screen time and the habitual churchgoers' use of screen time. So there is something about the way they're applying the word of God in their lives that does have a practical difference in the way they're living their life. The fourth thing,
it's not just screen time. It's also it is screen time, but it's also perspectives about screens
and what they're doing on their screens.
Yeah,
when they're on them.
Disciples are much more reflective about how they use it, why they use it. They're not perfect, but there's this real sense in which they're more likely to say they think they and their generation use screens too much, even though they themselves use it less. They're still even more they're more willing to be sort of self-reflective and more vigilant about their use of screens. So the Resilient Disciple is such an incredible story, right? Like there's not very many times in our work at Barna, because we're often looking at some of the challenges that the church faces. But we're looking at just like this incredible group of young people who represents, not tens of millions, but something like 3 to 4 million resilient young Christians in our country. And we did a global study. They're resilient young Christians in every context that we studied, 25 countries around the world. And so we keep recommending to church leaders, don't just focus on trying to, win everyone over. What can you do to really equip and empower these resilient disciples? Because they're already, you don't have to supercharge them. They're already sort of revving and ready to go.
They're going to be the ones that actually probably, lead their generation to Christ as well.
Right.
So, leaning into them, really important. And I really love in Gen Z Volume 2 too, the way that you profiled, not just how much screen time people were using, but how they were thinking about their screens, and seeing some different kind of categories and ways of thinking about how teenagers are using them and thinking about them. That's a really great feature of Gen Z Volume 2.
Thanks. So
I'd also say
experiencing Jesus, cultural discernment.
Yep. And now we're talking about meaningful relationships. And now we're talking about vocational discipleship. And I would say of the four, this is probably the one that most pastors say, oh, this is interesting. This is new language for me. And the idea is that what we saw in Resilient Disciples was that there was an integration of their faith in the way that they work and the way that they spend the time outside of church specific activity. And that was really interesting. And what we found is that almost every church that I've done workshops with on this, where I have them evaluate how they're doing in these 5 areas with their young people, they'll say, oh, we're terrible at vocational discipleship. And that kind of showed to be true of the 5 things, but is still a significant contributor to this idea that we have a real opportunity here to help young people integrate their vocational aspirations and what they're doing and how they're preparing for the future of their lives, and let faith be a guiding light in that. We know that God has made each of us to be unique. He's given us passions. He's given us desires. He's given us talents. How are we expressing and manifesting those in the work that we do? And what we're finding with those resilient disciples, they're thinking about that. And the majority of them, attribute their church to helping them navigate that purpose in their life. So that's kind of an important thing.
Yeah.
And then the last thing is countercultural mission. So this idea that they realize, and once again, this isn't a culture war word. This is a way of demonstrating the efficacy of trust in Christ. So when we think about the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, for example, that can be seen as a culture war story of these guys standing against what was wrong. It can also show a life that was involved in epic trust. And one thing that resilient disciples experience are moments of epic trust. We see that in Esther when she went and approached the king to save the people of Israel. That there's this moment that happens where they have to give evidence of the relationship they have with God, and how much confidence they have in it. And what it leads to is most of the time is the glorification of God, that God is made known through that experience. And we found that those that were resilient understood their posture and the relationship that they had to the world, and that their trust was in God, and that they were living in a way that trusted God with the decisions and the choices that they made.
So good. Such a fun thing. So talk about a fun project, because we're talking about the ways that the church actually produces resilient faith. Talk about how, maybe not cover each of the 5, but just sort of broad strokes, how you think the pandemic both revealed the power of those 5 practices, as opposed to maybe how before the pandemic it's sort of, oh yeah, we're doing that, but like what are ways that, as you've been talking to church leaders, it felt like it was a prophetic book relative to those 5 practices?
Well, obviously early on in the lockdown, I think and it's hard to remember because we kind of got into our routine But if we go back to the early days of the lockdowns, when most of us were not meeting as churches in any way, shape, or form, other than maybe streaming. And I remember on Facebook, right after that first Sunday, I just posted a question on my page, and I just said, what didn't you get today at Digital Church that you normally get? And it was very interesting to read the responses, because people knew they were missing something, but they couldn't put their finger on it. A lot of the best guesses were like fellowship or whatever. And, obviously the easiest things to deliver digitally were the sermon and the message and what goes on stage. And, one of the things that we said in our book is, if you can do it by yourself, it may not be the church. That's in Faith for Exiles. And to me, at that moment, I was sitting there going, I saw a lot of people like quoting that on Facebook and on Twitter and Instagram, stuff like that. If you can do it by yourself, it probably isn't the church. And so that was the thing that was being teased out, I think, is that if the stage can happen and there doesn't need to be any people in the room, then that may not be church. And so if we're just observers, and so it was interesting to watch, pastors struggling with trying to figure out, how do we get people involved? Our research showed that most people said they didn't sing along with worship. If you had younger children in your home, you were more likely to sing along with church than if you didn't. But that was an interesting thing. So I was encouraging worship leaders, and they're going, yeah, we're crushing it, digitally. And I'm like, are you though? Our research has shown that people aren't singing along. Yeah. And so I was saying, give people something to do. Give them something to write on while you're singing over them, like pull them into the service. And so it was very interesting as we watched, churches struggling with this, them thinking about, okay, church has to be more than a sermon and worship and what happens on the stage. And I think that's where people were seeing the discipleship deficit. Were there people able to keep going? My friend Tim Eldred, he always asked the question, if the youth group showed up at church and there was a closed for business, sign on the door, would the young people just go ahead and do church on their own? Would they be at a place where they would say, oh, we can't use the building, but we're going to go ahead and do our service ourselves? That's the state we need our congregants to be at, where they don't need the service, they don't need the building to continue to grow and gather in their faith. And I think that's kind of what we're going to see develop and build out over time.
That's good. We also did a series of conversations about 6 months ago, maybe it was a little longer, but we talked about these 5 conversations, essential conversations to have about the next generation during the pandemic. Mm-hmm. We'll put those in the show notes, and so listeners can go back and watch those conversations or listen to those conversations. I think they'll be very helpful to people, because we were talking about how the pandemic may actually accelerate. We're seeing this across a variety of gathering-oriented businesses. So, theater goers are not coming back to theaters quite yet in the same numbers. Church going is still far off its normal sort of pre-pandemic levels. And I think, as we predicted, that there will be a huge impact over the next 5 to 10 years on this critical period of time, the 18, 24 months, that people have been more disconnected than ever from the gathering of a church. And so what are you thinking today about ways that church leaders can sort of respond to the fact that this is going to be not just a blip on the radar, but potentially another kind of sort of tsunami of loss of faith? And maybe that's an overstatement, but it's like there's this huge amount of young people who would have been disrupted in their faith journeys. What could we say about what church leaders could do about that, or how they could think about that?
Well, I think we can't forget the skills that we've learned during this time. One is we've got what I call Zoom fluency, is a little word that came out of my mouth about a month ago. And literally everybody's had to figure out how to connect online in some way. And very few people don't know how to do that. That is something that we can leverage in ways, and it's an asset. We need to think about how we leverage that. Some people have done better at interactive online than other people have. We need to learn from them, and we need to realize something, because here's what I've noticed. I've been attending churches now that things have kind of opened back up again. And what I'm noticing is that the digital audience is now becoming back to like just a feed. And we need to really remember that if we've got, my new kind of little mantra is, if one person's joining the meeting on virtual, it's a virtual meeting. And that means we have to think about it differently than an in-person meeting. And so we still have to be giving a lot of attention to this, because there's still a huge opportunity out there to reach an audience. And so we can't kind of like lose the stewardship of that. So I think that's one element. And I think we all have to realize that, and I think there's going to be some grieving that happens. I think people don't know how they've changed yet by the pandemic and how things are different. I know for me, one of the things that happened is I've always traveled all my life, and I'm not traveling. I didn't travel as much during the pandemic. I still traveled, but not nearly as much. And I spent more consecutive days with my wife than I have in our entire 28 years of marriage. Now, I know some people are really struggling in their marriages right now as a result of that, but we had the opposite experience, to where I've really reoriented my feelings toward travel, not because of travel, but because I really don't want to leave my wife. And that's been something that's been new. She and I have never really thought much about the fact that I have to travel for what I do. Now I'm very much thinking about that. I don't know that we understand how we've fundamentally been changed in our relationships and the way that we value time. I think the workplace is going to reveal a lot of this. I think we're going to see a lot of people shifting around. And I think there's a lot of hope that people have had, that once we get to a certain place, we're going to be able to, live in this reality or whatever. And the reality is, we're going to find out that's not going to happen. And so when those expectations aren't met, there's going to be grief. And so I think as pastors, we need to really be mindful of that, that we have a lot of people that are grieving in ways, and that will be grieving as they find that out. And you know what? We have to realize too, things have shifted, and maybe it's not that people lost their faith, but maybe it's just exposing what wasn't there before. And we need to really look long and hard at that and go, okay, what is our responsibility? We're not 100% responsible for that, right? Like these habituals that we talked about that have been going to church, and maybe the pandemic causes them to walk through the door and not come back. I may not be responsible fully for that, but I do need to ask myself, was I really helping them, deepen in their discipleship? Was I really doing what I could do? How can I do better at that? How can I create a better environment moving forward for reaching those young people? And we'll see how it accelerates things. I don't think we completely know yet, but I think we need to be very alert. That's why I love these Church Pulse weekly programs, because they're causing us to think about things in the moment, in the current. And I think that's just really important. We've got to stay up on top of things like never before, because things are changing rapidly.
Well, I'll close with this story that when we were working on the project, one of the researchers who was working with us literally jumped out of the chair and said, "Dave, do you see that we found that the gospel is actually working in the lives of these young people?"
Yeah.
And it was such a striking moment, because again, we're kind of a bunch of nerds and geeks, and we like looking at the crosstabs and all the things, and it's hard for us to get too high or too low. But Allie Hawkins, her enthusiasm for what we were discovering was such a cool moment. And it reminded me of not only just the fun of the work that we do, but also the power of the gospel in changing and affecting young people's life and trajectory. And that's where we'll leave it today as we wrap up. Mark, any just sort of final words of hope and encouragement to leaders?
Yeah, I think, the thing that I just keep getting back to is the fact that the gospel means good news, and we have good news to share. Let's share that good news. Let's do it boldly. And the gospel is alive and at work, and it is making a difference in people's lives. Let's not let side issues in our present culture distract us from the good news and being those people of hope, being those people of healing by helping people put their trust in Jesus Christ. There's no greater thing that the church can do than that. And we need to make sure that we're the best at that, because that's our calling. That's our place, is to be the presence of Christ.
Mark Matlock, thanks so much for joining us on Church Pulse Weekly.
Absolutely. Thanks, David.
Okay, David. Well, that was really good to hear you and Mark reflect on things from back in 2019, that world we used to live in.
Yeah, no doubt. And as we talk about in our interview there, the reality is, I think that the pandemic is going to speed up some of the disconnections between young people in the church. And so that puts all the more urgency for us to pay attention to these trends.
Well, and it'll be fascinating over the years to, people are, not everybody, but a lot of people are now talking about the pandemic being a generation defining thing, like the Second World War, like the Depression, et cetera. What are the implications for learning? What are the implications for the normal trends that you would typically see as people head into adulthood, and so on and so forth? It'll be interesting to monitor that. David, so grateful for you and for all the research you continue to do. We're also really grateful for Belay, our partner in this episode. You can just text the word PULSE to 55123 for a free download today of their download, a free resource, Church Leaders, Essential Strategies to Unleash Productivity. So just text the word PULSE to 55123. David, we're back next week with a fresh episode. Subscribers, you'll get it automatically